welcome everyone to the last panel of the LSE Future of Humanity Summit. This summit is basically a culmination of lots of work over the last year from the LSE Public Debates Committee, as well as the LSE Effective Altruism Society. And the entire purpose of the summit has been to platform risks that are otherwise neglected within the window of public discourse. This final panel is going to be about what we call safeguarding existential security, where we look at general existential risk reduction strategies. Let me now proceed to introduce the panel, starting with, and this is the only time I will use your title, Martin, Lord Martin Rees. Lord Martin Rees is a British cosmologist and an astrophysicist. He is the 15th Astronomer Royal. He was born in 1995, and he was the president of the Royal Society between 2005 and 2010. Within the confines of this discussion, he co-founded the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University and serves on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Future of Life Institute. Secondly, we have with us Toby, who is an Australian philosopher. He founded Giving What We Can, an international society whose members pledge to donate at least 10% of their income to effective charities. He is a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, where his work is focused on existential risk. His recent book on the subject, which we are also giving away to select attendees of this conference, The Precipice: Existential Risk in the Future of Humanity, was published in March 2020 and is seen by many as the most contemporary compilation of existential risks that we face as a collective human civilization. Thank you for assisting me in that plug, Toby. Thirdly, we have with us Anders Sandberg, who is a researcher, science debater, futurist, transhumanist, and author. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University and is currently a senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. His research includes work on global catastrophic risks, particularly on the question of how to take into account the subjective uncertainty in risk estimates of low likelihood and get high consequence risks. Finally, we have with us Joan Rohlfing, who became President and Chief Operating Officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative in January 2010. Before joining the NTI, Joan held senior positions within the US Department of Energy during the Clinton administration as Senior Advisor for National Security to the Secretary of Energy, and as Director of the Office of Non-Proliferation and National Security. Joan is also a member of the National Security Directorate at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and is also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Welcome to all the panelists and welcome to all the attendees watching. Just a general note on the structure of the panel. Firstly, we're going to have some opening remarks from the speakers, following which we'll have a short moderated discussion, and following that, we'll take questions from all of you. To start us off, I would love for Toby to come in with his introductory remarks. Please, Toby.
Sure. Humanity has been here on the Earth for about 200,000 years. So that's 2,000 centuries before us, or about 10,000 generations, and about 100 billion individuals who have, through their accumulated innovations over that time, have built this modern world we see today. And if we're careful, then there's every reason that humanity could last for another 10,000 generations, or much longer. The typical mammal lasts for about 1 million years. And that would put humanity in its adolescence. And I think that that's an apt metaphor, one that's been used by Carl Sagan and others for a long time. And we are in this situation where we've got this growing power. These accumulated innovations over deep time have created this power, which in the 20th century reached this point where we could threaten ourselves. I date this kind of period to the first nuclear test, the Trinity test in 1945, as this moment when we could first, at least quite plausibly, destroy ourselves with our own technology. Prior to that, we'd lasted 2,000 centuries, surviving all of the natural risks. And that shows that the natural risk can't be all that high. It can still be high enough to be quite significant, but I believe that the anthropogenic risks are now even higher, and that they're rising as we develop newer and even more powerful technologies through this century and beyond. So I think that what humanity needs to do to end this period of heightened risk, which I call the precipice, is to rise to this challenge and to decide not to keep threatening itself with these risks. I think that we can do that. Ultimately, most of the risk is created by us, and so we can choose to stop creating it. It's not quite as simple as that. A lot of it's to do with complex dynamics between superpowers and so forth, as I'm sure we're going to hear later from Joan. But it is ultimately something that is within human control, and I propose that the term existential security to refer to a world that's got into a situation where existential risk is low and is kept low. So I think that we need to work on governance of new technologies, and also to work in terms of international relations and international law in order to get to that point. It's in the interests of all of us, and it's achievable. And I think that this could be the century where we correct for this mistake of creating these risks, and we make sure that that the future is secure. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Toby, for your opening remarks. Anders, please.
So I like to say that Toby is so pessimistic about the future. Just a million years. There is so much more time. I was once asked at a conference, just how big is the future? And that's kind of a theme of my current research project. And I'm using a term which I actually got from Toby, grand futures. Because quite often when we imagine the future, we tend to imagine it as the status quo. Like now, but maybe with a bit more pollution and flying cars. And I think that is a mistake, because we're living in an awesomely weird future from the perspective of the Middle Ages. Not to mention, of course, our Neolithic ancestors who would be absolutely shocked about having man-made caves, so much fat, sugar, and salt that we actually can get sick from it, and doing things that wouldn't even make sense. So we should expect that the variance of the future could be very vast. This means that there could be upsides that are much more grandiose than we normally would like to think or dare to think. But of course also downsides that could be absolutely horrific. And this magnitude of the future, I think, is another important aspect. Quite often when we talk about risk, we look at what we might lose, and it's a relatively negative, short, sharp shock to somebody like ourselves or our near and dear. Stretching your mind to encompass all of humanity takes effort. Stretching it to encompass future generation takes even more effort, but it looks like the magnitude of the value of the future is on a completely, literally astronomical level. And this, of course, leads to an interesting issue. How do we handle that value at risk? Because it looks like it's totally overwhelming. We still need to go to work. We still need to take a sensible policy option next week. But suddenly the number of lives at stake potentially is something that you have to write in scientific notation with at least a double-digit exponent. And maybe it might even be 3 digits in the exponent, which should fill many of us with an almost paralyzing fear. What if we do something wrong here? So that also leads to this interesting challenge for us. We're here at the potentially very early stage, and we don't know that much yet. Yet we want to take sensible action that increases the chances that the future will turn out okay, and that we will learn those crucial considerations that are hopefully going to lead us in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. Joan, please.
Thank you. I want to start by saying what an honor it is to be with you all on the panel. It's such important work you're doing across this community in general, and I deeply admire the important work of each of my panelists. I feel compelled to mention to all of you that although we didn't realize it when we founded my organization, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, that we were somehow prescient in choosing the acronym NTI. Our initials are generally understood to mean Nuclear Threat Initiative, but for the purposes of our discussion today, I'd like to say that what they really mean is that we're working on issues that are neglected, tractable, and important. I'm going to organize my comments around the theme of neglected, tractable, and important. but in reverse order. So starting with important, why are nuclear issues important? Why should you care? Because the nuclear threat has the potential to wipe out humanity now, instantly, today, this hour, even before our panel is finished, perhaps. The risk of nuclear use is also high and growing, and the system we've built for managing nuclear technology is antiquated, precarious, and dangerously unsustainable. Why do I say that? How can it possibly be such a high risk when we've lived with nuclear weapons without a nuclear war for the last 75 years? Because the world doesn't stand still, and a lot has changed in 75 years, politically and technologically. And as you all can appreciate, just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't happen or won't happen. So why am I worried? Currently, we're relying on a 75-year-old strategy called nuclear deterrence for preventing a nuclear weapons disaster. What other field can you think of that relies on a 75-year-old strategy or operating system? In the years immediately following World War II, a group of US academics, government practitioners, military officials reasoned that the best way to prevent a nuclear attack was to threaten retaliation against an adversary with a nuclear attack of our own. As long as we maintained an assured survivable capability to respond to an enemy attack, any attack against us would be futile and a nuclear war could be successfully deterred. This strategy was based on a game theory model and assumed that each party would behave rationally, have adequate time to make rational decisions, would operate with perfect information, and could have confidence in the reliability of their operating systems. But let's fast forward to today. We have an extremely complex system of 9 nuclear states, not 2. We may not have rational players. We have delivery vehicles that are so fast that leaders essentially have only 5 to 7 minutes to decide whether to launch a nuclear attack. The warning and weapon systems may or may not be reliable. We have an infodemic of disinformation and distortion, the potential for deep fakes, and historically high political tensions between key actors, for example, the US and Russia. The chinks in the armor of nuclear deterrence are many. What if nuclear warning systems were successfully sabotaged by a cyber attack? And erroneously, leaders launched a counterattack. What if there was false warning of an incoming attack during a period of political crisis? What if terrorists acquire a crude nuclear device? Do we really think they will be deterred from using one? Nuclear deterrence was not designed to address any of those scenarios. Do we really want to continue to rely on a strategy that is premised on the threat of mass annihilation? And that is premised on rational actors and the system working perfectly forever? Wouldn't we be better off with a strategy and a system that, if it failed, wouldn't fail catastrophically? That's what we need to be working on, building a new nuclear security paradigm that doesn't threaten to end our species. We ought to be working on one that, if it does fail, it will not cause extinction or even a civilizational catastrophe. So that brings me to my second point, and I'll move more quickly through the other points, and that is tractable. The nuclear threat is a totally tractable issue. It's a man-made problem. There are man-made solutions to it. It's a totally preventable global catastrophe. I think technology is key. We can harness the power of new tech for problem solving. Machine learning, I think, has the potential to help us create a much more effective nuclear control regime that gives us confidence that nuclear technology can't be used for weapons. We'll need new governance arrangements, but technology and governance alone are not enough. Even more important will be creating the political space for change, shifting the Overton window. We need to start by shifting the deeply entrenched belief system held by nuclear weapon states that a nuclear system premised on mass annihilation is the best way to keep us safe. And instead, we need to focus on creating a new paradigm that can't cause civilizational catastrophe or extinction. Your generation can help build the awareness that is needed and the momentum for change, and can help create the intellectual capital we need to define a new and better paradigm. Finally, neglected. Nuclear is so neglected. I like to say it's the greatest existential threat that no one has ever heard of, except maybe the folks listening in on this call. We've shifted from nuclear being considered one of the most important issues facing mankind during the Cold War to being an almost invisible threat. Paltry investments are being made in next generation thinking, ideas, technology, and culture. The community of deep expertise is dying, and I mean literally dying. They're aging out. Not even the EA community is working on nuclear with the same degree of energy, research, and commitment. Nuclear appears to be viewed as an old threat, perhaps less relevant, or not deemed existential. I don't have time now to say more about nuclear winter, but perhaps in the Q&A we can come back to that. In terms of investments, just a few metrics to show how neglected it is. And I'm going to use the US as an example. The US spends about $50 billion per year to, at the moment, for modernization of US nuclear forces. That is roughly $50 billion a year to perpetuate the 70-year-old operating system of nuclear deterrence. This level of expenditure is expected to continue for a while and add to a total price tag of about $1 trillion for modernization over about a 30-year period of the US nuclear stockpile. On the other hand, as a measure of comparison, investments by government in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons are significantly smaller, on the order of 1 to 2% of that 50 billion being invested in sustaining the capability for mass annihilation. And in terms of the civil sector, a recent report published by the MacArthur Foundation shows that as of 2018, there was approximately 81 million of total philanthropic funding in the nuclear field. That's obviously quite small compared to government. And the bad news, MacArthur, who funds a third to 45% of that amount, announced a few weeks ago that they're going to be withdrawing from the field. So that's where you come in. We need your help. Here's what you can do. Get involved, educate yourselves, be part of the solution, come work in this field. Help us create the new paradigm. We need more research. We need to work on that paradigm so that if it fails, it will fail safe. Come be a part of the transformation of this field and join us on this nuclear moonshot. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, Joan. I'll just flag post here that what you said about nuclear security being the most neglected risk is interesting because we had synthetic biology experts and AI alignment experts earlier today who would say the same thing about those risks. I flag post this here because that's sort of part of the discussion I want to tease out later on in the moderated discussion. Having said that, Martin, please.
Thank you. I want to talk a bit about time spans. When we go to a cathedral, we realize that those who built it knew of nothing beyond Europe. They thought there might be an apocalypse within a millennium. But despite these constricted horizons, and despite their deprived and harsh lives, they built these immense and glorious buildings. Those who conceived them knew they wouldn't be finished in their lifetime, and their legacy still elevates our spirits nearly a millennium later. Unlike them, we now know a great deal about our world. We know we're stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, a planet with a future measured in billions of years, whose fate depends on humanity's collective actions this century, as Anders said. But all too often, our focus is short-term and parochial. Planning horizons span decades at most. They're not matched to the global challenges that face us in this century. But there's an explanation for this seeming paradox. Medieval people's lives played out against a backdrop that changed slowly. They thought their children and grandchildren would lead similar lives and were confident that they'd appreciate the finished cathedral. But unlike them, we suspect that 2 generations hence, priorities and technologies will will be unpredictably different from today. We don't know how much. And we know the policies that must be adopted in the next few decades, which we're confident will reduce the risk of setbacks to humanity. But we don't really know what to do to improve safety on a longer timescale, because emergent technologies are so disruptive that we genuinely can't be sure what policies our 22nd century successors will consider benign and which will be damaging. In particular, it's on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may themselves become malleable through deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technology. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only a few centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a real game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity against a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional or ethical resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of how we behaved and thought. So I think it's unrealistic to envisage human beings persisting unchanged for many thousand years. And that's why, as Toby knows, I'm rather skeptical of his concept of a global conclave lasting a few centuries, during which we, by which he means humans like us, deliberate on the optimum longer-term future. It can be so different. And also, let me conclude with an astronomical perspective. By 2100, I'd expect there'll be a small community on Mars. But don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth. It's a dangerous illusion to think that space offers an escape from the Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars, and there's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these Martian pioneers, and this is why. They'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat, so they'll have a more compelling reason than those of us on Earth to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that by then exist. These techniques, we hope, will be restrained here on Earth on prudential and ethical grounds, but they're way beyond the clutches of the regulators. And we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to alien environments. So it's this new spacefaring species who will spearhead the post-human era. And if they become mainly electronic, they'll be near immortal. Interstellar voyages won't daunt them. This will be the rapid, intelligent design type of evolution. And this leads to a vision that Nick Bostrom has adumbrated, colonizing the galaxy and the Virgo cluster, accommodating 10 to the 30th of our remote descendants. In fact, I heard Nick expound this at a Sci-Fu conference in Palo Alto. And he added that every year we delay prioritizing a massive space colonization program, we're denying life to 10 to the power 20 happy people. This bemused even the Silicon Valley uber geeks in the audience, and me as well, because it's so far from what we can conceptualize that it is surely too vague an idea to put into any utilitarian calculus. To raise one obvious flaw, if happy aliens are out there already, then by encroaching on their territory, we'd make a vast negative contribution to cosmic contentment. So I think in our planning, even when we think about existential risks, there's no point in trying to quantify anything more than a few centuries ahead. Maybe even that's too far. Just to be clear, I'm not claiming that Nick's scenario is crazy, because in 4 billion years, Darwinian selection has led from protozoa to us, and we've got even longer lying ahead, and designed evolution will be even faster. But I would argue that because things change so fast, our focus should be to ensure that these unimaginable possibilities aren't foreclosed by human extinction this century. That's the longest time scale that even cathedral thinking can encompass in our fast changing world. That's my main point. Thank you.
Thank you, much, Martin. And that's also a very good segue to how I want to frame this discussion. We spent a lot of our energies today going over the nitty-gritties of specific risks, whether it's the alignment problem, risk posed by synthetic biology, engineered pandemics, etc. I want to take this discussion a different place, where I want to ask different, and the risk of sounding conceited, grander questions about existential risks. And I want to start very simply. How do we categorize existential risk? Does the term even hold a conceptual meaning? And I ask this in two senses. The first is I did a straw poll before the summit where I went around LSE asking research students who are research students at LSE, so I would assume some degree of knowledge and intelligence there, about what they think existential risk means. The vast majority thought it meant the risk you suffer from existential dread. And I don't mean to be coy here, because the term just hasn't caught on within the window of public discourse. So can we make this term more accessible? And then the second question I have about categorizing existential risk is that there's a lot of internal disagreement within very well-intentioned communities about what should and shouldn't classify as an existential risk. Within that remit then, how do we have this discussion about what is an existential risk to begin with? And is that correct label to use? Toby, considering that phrase features prominently in the subtitle of your book, I'll ask you to start off.
Sure. So I think an existential risk is a very useful concept. It was developed by Nick Bostrom. What he was trying to do was he had read John Leslie's book, a fantastic book that really makes the case that human extinction would be one of the worst possible things that could happen, and even a small chance of it is far too much. Nick noticed that this argument, there were a whole lot of really unusual features of extinction risk that would come up. For example, it was necessarily unprecedented. Humanity has never gone extinct. By the time we do, it'll be too late to come up with argumentation about why we need to avoid going extinct. So at any point where you can act on this problem, it will be unprecedented. This means that you can't help yourself to frequencies of, a frequentist kind of understanding of probabilities when it comes to this event. It creates a lot of unique challenges. It also means that humanity has to, if we want to survive for 1 million years, or as Anders suggests, for potentially much longer, 1 billion years until the end of the Earth, or perhaps 1 trillion years until most of the stars have burnt out. That if we want to survive for any of these lengths, we have to do so without ever once succumbing to extinction risk. But this is true for some other kinds of risks as well. The key feature is that there's a kind of irrevocability about it, and that it's not just any irrevocable risk. For example, if we lose a species, that's something that we may never be able to get back if we lose the information contained in that species. But it's something where our entire potential gets lost irrevocably. And we can also then understand why it is that the damages of this, we would lose not just our present, but our entire future. And this is because there's no way back from it. And so Nick noticed that there were other things, such as an extremely deep collapse of civilization. Perhaps if we, global warming or something else, put the Earth into a state where we could never again establish civilization, even if humans were still alive, that would have a lot in common with it. As would certain examples of totalitarian outcomes. George Orwell considered the possibility of a permanent totalitarian state, obviously not quite permanent, it would eventually die out, as a kind of existential catastrophe. There's a lot of focus in 1984 about this inescapability of it. And he imagined an incredibly robust system where humanity really loses its potential at the moment it goes into that system, even if there's a later date when it goes extinct. So I think this is a very useful concept, and so I understand it, and I try to clarify it a bit in the Precipice, in terms of potential, and in terms of the destruction of our potential, or another way to think of it is an irrevocable loss of almost all of the value that we could achieve. And that's not just a anthropocentric idea. I'm thinking about the loss of humanity. In humanity, I count all of our descendants, whether they be flesh and blood, or perhaps artificial intelligence systems, or what have you. Martin.
Okay. Can I come in now?
Please do.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think Toby would agree, it's a slightly unfortunate word. Existential is used in so many contexts by the public and by the press. It's not really used in the way that he wants to use it. And so I think if we were to talk about sort of catastrophic risks and extinction, which are two different things, those are clear cut. Whereas existential risk is being used about, what's happening to our government and things of that kind in the public mind. And so I think it's needed to confusion rather than clarity. So I think catastrophic risks, global threats can be understood and extinction can be understood. And that might be better. And I think the other point I would like to make is that talking about we, to me, not just humans, but inconceivably different entities is, I think, very confusing. The point is, my point is that humans may not exist in their present form for even 1,000 years, certainly not for millions of years. They'd be quite different. So I think that's why we can't really plan or allow for the welfare of people far beyond 1,000 years from now.
So,
and before you come in, Toby, I'm actually very interested to hear what Joan has to say here, because she works within what are policy communities. So, Joan, on the Beltway, on K Street in DC, all of those places, does the term existential risk hold any coinage or currency? Is it a term that's foreign to these policy communities? Is it a term that has resonance? How do you deal with it? And then secondly, my understanding is that the NTI also works on, for instance, biological weapons, chemical weapons. So how do you prioritize existential risks within the remit of that question?
Thanks. It's a great question. And I would say in DC, there isn't the same kind of nuanced understanding of the definitions that both of you just offered, but the term existential risk is used often in conjunction with nuclear threats and increasingly, particularly through this period of pandemic, people realize the bio threat is an existential threat as well. If you pressed the average person to explain what that means, you certainly wouldn't get the kind of answers that we just heard from Toby and Martin. I would say at NTI, we make less of a distinction between, we certainly understand the distinction between catastrophic and an extinction event, but we think catastrophic is bad enough to warrant very high level of effort to bring about systemic solutions to these terrible threats. There are moral reasons, civilizational reasons, if one wanted to be, really kind of focused in closely, economic reasons. And we don't necessarily try to rank order between biological and nuclear. We're predominantly focused on those two threats at NTI, and we try to be driven by the opportunity we see for action. We are also driven by available resources. And just to pick up on the thread that you opened up earlier in observing that the biosecurity community mentions that they believe bio is the most neglected threat. It's certainly a neglected threat, and I don't view it as a competition. We have hard work to do in multiple domains. What worries me about nuclear is that it's such a real and present danger, but the trend is going in the wrong direction. It's becoming less and less visible. There's less resource and less intellectual capital being invested in nuclear, whereas I'll call them the new threats, even though they're not that new, but bio and AI are becoming much more interesting. In particular, I would say for younger people, for many of the students who may be participating in this event today, there's a lot of energy behind understanding the biological threat and developing solutions, and same with AI, not so with nuclear.
Andres, do you want to come in there, please?
Yeah. So a few years ago, I was attending a meeting where people from the probabilistic and quantitative risk assessment community were interacting with people from the global catastrophic risk community. It was a fun meeting, a lot of interesting meeting. But what I most remember was when one person said, look, a dirty bomb on Lower Manhattan, that's an existential threat from my perspective. That's bad enough. And I remember being mildly outraged by that, because by my standard, well, that's just a low problem. That's a policing matter compared to a really big one. But of course, from his perspective, beyond that point, yes, there might be even worse things, but this was already worse enough. During the Cold War, a lot of the discussion when people were trying to promote nuclear disarmament, like to point out that there is enough nuclear weapons to kill everybody a certain number of times over. Of course, these calculations were somewhat spurious and most interesting, kind of beside the point. They were aimed at the general public and trying to get them to understand the absurdity of the situation. But it was a very weak argument, of course, inward towards the policymakers and the organizations actually running the Cold War, because they just wanted deterrence. And whether that deterrence was an existential threat to humanity or merely global devastation doesn't matter very much. Beyond a certain point, it's a credible, sufficiently intense threat. Now, turning this around, is there a difference for us who want to reduce the risks, whether they're existential or catastrophic or so? I think there is something that matters. It might be that existential risks are morally prior, that they actually tend to trump a lot of considerations that we care about. There are 3 movies that deal with existential risk that handle this in very, very different ways. I'm going to be brief, but the first one is Dr. Strangelove, where there is the scene where the good doctor suggests that we're going to use a computer to decide who lives and dies and can go down in mine shafts, taking a very utilitarian categorization. And there is general outrage towards this approach. Then there is the impact, where it turns out that the president has a lottery for who gets to go into caves when the asteroid, because that is regarded by him as the fair. And then there is the really bad movie 2012. Don't watch it. But in order to fund the arcs to save humanity, they sell tickets of €1 billion a piece to the super rich so they can fund the arcs. And this is, of course, treated as exceedingly unfair. Although, at least within the slightly crazy world building of the movie, without that, humanity could build the arcs and save them. The reason I'm bringing up these movies is that they all deal with an issue of justice. And when disasters happen, normally it's the poor and weak who are hurt the most. And generally, we are correctly saying we need to reduce the risks of these ones because they're not just bad in general, they're also quite unjust things. The weird thing seems to happen that when we scale up the size of a disaster, when it gets existential, justice seems to go out the window. Maybe you can find out the truly hardcore deontology saying that actually it's better that the world is destroyed than saved in an unjust way. But I think practically everybody else will say, yeah, you hold your conviction there, we're going to the arcs. So I do think it matters, especially when dealing with convincing people about policies for fixing things. In many cases, there is no reason to get into the thickets of ethics, which is probably just as well because we can't get great agreement on it. But it's important to recognize sometimes where we level off, where we say this is bad enough, do have impacts on how we can have our conversation with the public and each other.
That's actually a very interesting segue because I want Toby to come back in and sort of round this conversation out. And here I sort of professionally lay my cards on the table. So I'm very vested in social activism in Pakistan, where it's all about fighting for religious equality, gender equality, which are genuine existential threats within some communities. In that space again, how can you swing a public about the question of the species survival when they're so caught up in the question of their own survival? And B, is that even necessary insofar as you don't have to convince everyone to get this push towards existential risk reduction? I'm very interested to hear what you think there.
Sure. I mean,
and then Martin, of course, after.
Regarding what's been said just before, it seems like part of the question is existential risk the right concept? And part is it the right term? I do think it's the right concept, and I think it's the best term we have, but it is a flawed term. But I think that the other alternatives are even more flawed. But that's a matter for debate. The question of can we convince people about this? Can we get people interested in it? I don't think we can get everyone interested in it, but I do think we can get many people, and many more than we traditionally have. This is something where a lot of the conversation over the last 10 years or so, Martin mentioned this kind of thinking about, could we save 10 to the power of 50 lives if we, get to the Virgo cluster and some small chance of that, and and so forth. That kind of conversation is certainly going to appeal to only a small fraction of people and actively turn off a large fraction of people. But ultimately, the destruction of everyone alive and everything that humanity could ever have achieved, and the permanent ruin of all peoples, all cultures, all temples and cathedrals, all writings, is obviously an absolutely terrible thing. And everyone can agree with that. And this could be a much broader idea. I try to present it in such a way in my book. And I think that that is a way that the community discussing this needs to move to be able to talk about it in those terms. Even then, there are going to be many people who are caught up in very urgent things. And I think it's not unreasonable for them to not have the time to engage with this. What I'm hoping is that it can build from quite a small starting position, at least the general idea of existential risk. I think nuclear is something that did get very big, and climate is also very big. Everyone has heard of these things. Many different concepts and people involved in them at the various times were household names, etc. I think we can get there, but I do think that will require substantial time and effort.
Martin, please.
Yes, well, I mean, I think we'd all be deeply saddened at the thought that all the construct of human civilization would be destroyed after our death. So I think we all have a concern about that. And so it's the survival of civilization which you care about. Wiping everyone out is actually rather hard. You can't imagine a nuclear war or a pandemic wiping out every human beings, but it would lead to a state where civilization was unrecoverable. So I think that is, as Toby rightly says, that's a big distinction. Would it be the irrecoverable end of human civilization? But there's one thing where I might disagree with some of the existential risk people, which is that if you ask how much worse is it to destroy everyone rather than destroying just 90%, then the classic argument is it's far, far worse because you're destroying all future generations. And that's true in a sense, but I think that's confusing in a policy response. As I tried to say in my earlier remarks, we've no idea what would be good for the universe more than 100 or a few hundred years ahead. I mean, if there are lots of aliens out there, then us surviving may be contributing negatively to net happiness. So it's not at all obvious that it will be a loss. So we've no idea of the global or cosmic effects of what happens more than a few hundred years from now. So we shouldn't put in this huge factor in ethical decisions, weighting the welfare of these far future generations more than that of people alive. We've got to stick with people alive and people in the sufficiently immediate future that we can predict what their taste will be and what environment they'll be in.
And that's actually very interesting because I think this famous experiment from the philosopher 𝗘𝘅𝗶𝗂𝗏 personally had a lot of resonance for me, but I've tried to state it to other people and they've just found the entire idea absurd. So there's definitely a cultural resonance and the subjectiveness to what thought experiments have resonance for you and which ones don't. I do want to sort of zoom out though from the individual. And I want to look at the political elephant in the room, which is most often national sovereignty. Whether you talk about pandemic responses in the context of the WHO, whether you're talking about India and Pakistan having nuclear weapons in the 90s, the consistent question that we confront is nation states have certain rights and freedoms from international intervention. And often this comes up against the prerogatives of existential risk. Within that frame then, how do we confront existential risks which have truly global implications when we also have national governments making decisions which could potentially hurt all of us? And I want Joan ideally to chip in there first.
It's a really important question, and I think we, as part of our thinking in developing new paradigms, and in particular, the new governance mechanisms we're going to need to manage these global catastrophic or existential threats, we're going to have to move beyond, to some extent, the concept of sovereignty, or define it differently. I'm struck, we already have a body of laws, international humanitarian laws, laws of war, that govern and prohibit certain types of behavior that a sovereign may wish to use, but it's deemed, frankly, inhuman and therefore illegal. For example, in the use of weapons of war, you need to be able to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The use of force has to be proportional to the aim. You cannot induce needless suffering. And it's hard, just again, thinking about nuclear, to imagine how you could use a nuclear weapon that somehow is able to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and is proportional to the end. So I think sovereignty is a concept that deserves a lot of thought. And as we think about different structures for collective security, we're going to have to innovate in that space.
It's also worth noticing that the nation state is an innovation itself. Nation states didn't really exist a few centuries ago. They came about because of the idea that nations made for a sensible foundation for building the state. For much of history, it was mostly a matter of might makes right, or I inherited this lovely state from my grandfather, who was a very good warrior and managed to set up the taxation system. What happened with the nation state? Yeah, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. The interesting thing here, I'm totally not going to continue making a fool of myself as a political philosopher or anything like that, is that we can innovate kinds of states and the kinds of sovereignty exist. We have interesting examples like the European Union. For all its enormous flaws, it's probably one of the best guarantees that there is not going to be a major war on the European continent, because the bureaucracy would be horrendous and nobody really wants to file reports about that. You can probably come up with entirely new solutions using new technologies. There is actually quite a lot of room for innovation, which normally we don't tend to think about, because we tend to assume that states, like our buildings, are stable, solid structures that won't change that much. But of course, over longer timescales, our concepts change a lot, and they have to. And I do think some of the dangerous technologies we're thinking about do change how we have to conceptualize it. Nick Bostrom has a very disturbing paper, The Fragile World Hypothesis, where he basically argues that if we're unlucky, we might end up with technologies that make civilization impossible unless we handle them very carefully. And he argues that the current sovereign nation state system with this semi-anarchy simply cannot handle such technologies. We might hope that he's wrong, that such technologies will not be found, or that actually people are way more sensible than we assume, but I don't think many people trust that. So it seems like we really need to play around with improving that. But in some cases, it might be smaller things. Many things that make the world safer are not necessarily on the national level. It might be international organizations, when we have various forms of United Nations-like organizations, but also things like the Internet Engineering Task Force. I think there is room for quite a lot of more things than that act as a glue and dampers and other protections for humanity.
Yeah, and indeed, the philosopher Nick Bostrom, within the Vulnerable World Hypothesis paper, also makes the perhaps harrowing suggestion of inserting a freedom tag into each individual so as to surveil their daily activities and prevent existential risk. But staying away from what is perhaps even further down what we would call speculative reasoning amongst many in the audience, let's take Martin and then Toby. I'm interested to hear whether you think national sovereignty is at political odds with existential risk reduction. Martin, please.
Well, I think the one thing we've learned from the pandemic is that there are some events which are intrinsically global and have to be responded to globally. Nations by themselves can't cure the problem. And I think what this means is that we're going to need more international bodies like the IAEA and a stronger World Health Organization. And we're going to need other bodies perhaps because the climate change scenario is a sort of slow motion version of COVID. COVID's happened fast, but climate change is like the syndrome of the frog in the warming pan of water, not realizing the danger until it's too late. And that's the situation we're in regarding climate change. But that again is going to require an international body to monitor compliance with pledges made by different countries about cutting CO2 emissions and that. So I think it's clear that we're going to have to dilute national sovereignty by setting up more of these international global bodies for the reasons I mentioned. And also, of course, we've learned that international trade is fragile if it depends on supply chains, and one link in one chain can screw things up. So we've learned that there's a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. We've gone too far towards efficiency and reduced resilience. So I think everyone is realizing how interdependent sovereign nations, even the most powerful ones, are, even though they do have, as we know, certain values and traditional associations.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Toby, please.
So I think we tend to, I mean, I kind of agree with the other panelists here, that sovereignty is an issue here, and it does cause problems. But we also forget, 75 years ago, we didn't have a UN. When I'm thinking about these issues, I'm thinking about the big issues over the next century. And that's a long time. And I suggest that we need to get our act together in terms of international coordination. Now, if you try to imagine next year trying to do something as big as the UN, it's not going to happen. But there are certain times, certain kind of cruxes, in humanity's past where great changes have become possible, and World War II precipitated one of them. And in fact, that was the beginning of this nuclear age, or what I call the precipice. Was exactly the moment when massive numbers of international institutions were formed, and types of international law were created, and so on and so forth. It's entirely possible that, since that was just 75 years ago, that in the next 100 years there are transformations as big or bigger than that. And so I think we need to keep our eyes open for this. We're not going to be able to create this in the next couple of years. But by the same token, if one of these crisis moments really comes up, and we haven't done any thinking about where we need to go, then we're not going to have good ideas to move to, and we'll move to whatever we happen to be thinking of at the time. So I do think we need to think these things through in advance.
And I think this perhaps brings us to the center of what people think is the biggest problem here, which is resolving global coordination problems. And I think one thing that the Global South often thinks of when they think of international coordination is Western hegemony. One takes the example of the United Nations there, or broadly any supranational structure which seeks to impose what are seen to be sometimes unfair, uneven, and unjust standards on certain countries, and then not others. So there's certainly an interplay of power politics here, which occurs both in the private sphere, in the realm of corporate power, and also in the public sphere, in the realm of great state powers. How do you deal with that issue, the fundamental inequity in our great power politics? Joan, would you like to start on that?
Yeah. And a couple of comments on the rolling conversation here, which is very interesting. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, and Martin picked up on this, is that by definition, global threats cannot be solved by any sovereign acting alone. Right? It's one of the unique distinguishing features of a global threat, that it can only be overcome by states working collectively in cooperation with each other. And that suggests, and to pick up on what Toby was just talking about, it's over time for us to begin thinking about what new governance structures might look like, and how we can develop international structures that are different than the member state organizations we have today, that fill a vital role, like the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, or the International Atomic Energy Agency. But because they're a collection of sovereign nations that bring parochial views to the table and often prevent consensus agreements, we need to move beyond that. And I think there are a few models out there, but nothing that quite does the trick yet. We need to look at enhancing public-private partnerships. We need to look at what kinds of things can be done privately, but it's clearly a space where we need to innovate, and we ought to invest some serious research effort in innovating. And we need not only to start thinking about this challenge, but we need to begin talking about a transformed world. We need to be thinking and imagining what the end goal could look like, what kinds of models we could design that would enable humanity to flourish over the long term and not leave us hostage to the acts of a single nation that could wipe out the entire species. So this is an area that's ripe for some work, and where all of the students participating in this call can make a difference.
Thank you, Joan. Martin, do you want to comment?
Thank you. I think obviously we've got to ensure that the world has a minimum number of justified grievances between nations. Otherwise, it'll be turbulent and disruptive. And to take a particular example, I think we do have to worry about whether some of the countries of the South, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, may lag behind. They don't have the opportunity to develop the way the East Asian tigers did by undercutting manufacturing costs because robots are taking that over, etc. And so it may be hard for them to catch up, and the inequality may survive. And the other point is that the one technology they do have in those countries is the internet. So they know what they're missing. They know the injustice of their fate. And of course, migration is much easier. And I think there really will have to be something like a mega Marshall Plan to help those countries to develop their economies. Otherwise, we'll be led to a situation where we have not just the terrible inequality within each country, which are bad enough, but the embedded inequalities between the countries of the North, as it were, and some of those of the South.
That's very interesting. And Anders, I actually want you to come in here in the context of emerging technologies. Do you see this fundamental inequity in terms of technological access? And then how does that interplay with existential risk reduction?
A lot of it depends on what kind of technology it is, because access to a technology depends very much on the threshold of entry. So I grew up playing around with a home computer, and by introducing the personal computer in the late 70s, early 80s, computing became accessible, and making software is relatively cheap. Almost anybody who have access to a computer can start writing software. So we got this flourishing of software and the internet, which was very easy to get into. On the other hand, building nuclear power plants requires very special things, special expertise, and that means that it's hard to get in on that game, which might have been relatively fortunate for the world in this case. When it comes to biotechnology, it used to be that it was very hard, and it's getting easier and easier, which is both very good news and very worrisome from many perspectives. So it's going to depend on the nature of a technology, and that is tricky because it's going to depend on the different technologies themselves. So tying this to the previous conversation, I was wondering about this power conflict and realized that I really don't like even thinking about it. I'm not good at that kind of stuff. I'm very much happy when I discover win-win situations. Because then if you can just point it out and convince people this is a win-win, then we can get everybody pulling in the same direction. Great. There is also a lovely situation where instead of when people are pulling on a rope, you try to push it sideways in the neutral direction. There are many situations where there are useful things that can be done that are not part of the power conflicts. And again, when you have debates in academia or about policy, quite often that means that you have entrenched positions and it's no good use of your energy to try to fix it. Try to deal with stuff that's just on the edge of the window. The problem here is, of course, this is a somewhat cowardly approach. Sometimes you actually do need to wade in, have a vision, bang heads together and convince everybody that, okay, we need to change what we're doing. But that's kind of not my approach. I'm fond of when technology changes the rules of the game. The problem is, also historically, we know that it is not predictable where you end up. The actual meaning of a personal computer or the website was not obvious when they were created. And they got their meanings through a lot of interactions. And in many cases, they were much better than expected. And in some directions, much worse than expected. So I think by developing technology, we open Pandora's boxes. But there are some boxes that are more worth opening than others. Some of them, we have good reason to think that, yeah, renewable energy, relatively unlikely to blow up in our faces. That's a good one. The geoengineering, that looks pretty scary, and we have big governance issues. A technology for cleaning up the stratosphere, oh, that would be useful to have before we got geoengineering, because then we could undo if we do something wrong. So I'm very fond of the idea of differential technology development. Try to look at what technologies do we want to have early, because they might make other technologies safe. In the case of artificial intelligence, it's AI safe. In the case of biotechnology, we want methods of detecting what's going on and maybe mopping up organisms that shouldn't be around and immunizing or vaccinating us. So that's my approach to emerging technologies here.
That's very interesting. Toby, do you want to round out that discussion?
Yeah, I hope that that there isn't some giant polarization between the North and the South on this issue. But even if there were, I'm not actually sure which way around it would go. I think that there's some kind of stereotype where you could imagine the global South thinking that concern about existential risk was a kind of luxury concern, that only those who have their basic necessities met are going to indulge in. I think that that's, one could pattern match to that and think that that's how it will go. But I'm not very sure about that, because the existential risks that we're currently facing from nuclear weapons and from climate are being mainly imposed by the global North on everyone, including the global South, who are not actually getting anywhere near as much benefit from the technologies whose side effects are imposing this risk. So I could also imagine them banding together and saying, we've had it with these imposition of risk in a way that's against international law with nuclear weapons. So I just don't really know which way around it would even go. But I hope that it doesn't become a kind of polarized issue on a North-South divide. And I hope it doesn't become a polarized issue on a left-right divide either. I think that eventually, at the start, environmentalism was not a polarized left-right issue, but it became one. And I think much to its detriment, I think we've had a lot less action on it because of that. And I think that it is very important that we avoid existential risk becoming polarized. I think this is, as I think Ronald Reagan said about environmentalism, this isn't a left issue or a right issue, it's an everyone issue. And I think it's also not a North or a South issue, it's an everyone issue.
That's very interesting. I'll take one last question of my own, namely because I've gotten several questions from the audience, which are significantly better than mine. And please keep sending in those questions. These are very helpful and will help frame the discussion in the coming minutes. The final question I have is in terms of the cost of existential risk reduction. When you start talking about bans on certain types of research, there are certain members of the scientific community who express some caution there. When you talk about surveillance, for instance, of populations in the context of pandemics, significant concerns of civil liberties often ensue. Similar concerns, naturally, as we just talked about, ensue in terms of national sovereignty. So in terms of existential risk reduction, do you think that there might be a risk of us over-adjusting and then creating existential risks through solving existential risks? And do you think in any case there are significant costs attached to how we shepherd this change at the precipice? Toby, why don't you start here?
Yeah, it's not easy to work out how to best run the course between these hazards. I think that you're right that that there are ways of doing this that could make the problem worse, either through prompting people to just retaliate. People who think that this is far too onerous and they've had enough. That's true with many different policy things. There's the thing that could actually be good if people would do it, but then there's the thing that's best when you take into account the fact that people hate the earlier idea. I think that that there are a lot of things that are financially cheap that we could do. For example, on nuclear weapons, I think there's a lot of cost-saving things that we could do that would reduce risk, and we should be doing those things. And I think that it's very hard to work out exactly how much money humanity is spending on existential risk reduction because of the issue that there's a lot of money, say, spent on climate change related things, but only a small fraction of it is to do with existential risk aspects, but it's hard to say what. But we can safely say that it's less than the amount humanity spends on ice cream. I kind of ran the numbers on that, and pretty much any way you slice it, that ends up being true. So I think that we could be prepared to spend substantially more on this, and also to take some sacrifices. I think that this is one of, if not the most important moral issue of our age. And I think that we need to rise to this challenge. But if it tries to get pushed too quickly when people aren't ready for it and people aren't used to the ideas and they haven't thought it through, or they don't even know what the words mean, then that's not going to work, and it's going to be hard to scale it up. So one wants to be very careful about what's the right way or the right speed at which to scale up either kind of financial or policy aspects of these questions.
That's quite true. Joan, do you want to come in here?
Just a quick comment on that, which is, I was thinking, I agree with everything you said, Toby, and I was thinking a crisis would certainly precipitate a likely over-adjustment in terms of the actions we might take. I think about the implications of 9/11 in the United States for civil liberties and all of the draconian measures that were taken to try and prevent a similar event from happening again. Imagine if we had a nuclear detonation somewhere, what kinds of changes that would create in terms of infringements on civil liberties. So I think part of our argumentation about the kind of system we want to build, need to build one that protects something like civil liberties, should take into account that we want to be ahead of the curve. I also just quickly wanted to comment on the previous discussion about the North-South cleavage and equity and justice there in the nuclear space, to say that cleavage is very much alive, very palpable. It led to the negotiation of the ban treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which at the moment, it entered into force in January, but only on the basis of non-nuclear weapon states. And out of extreme frustration by the non-nuclear weapon states that the nuclear weapon states are holding the entire world hostage to a cataclysmic event that impacts us all. I might note, however, that because all nuclear weapon states are located in the Northern Hemisphere, the expectation is that it is the Northern Hemisphere that would suffer more significantly. And that's a whole nother discussion we can come back to. The South will not be spared, however.
Martin, please.
Well, I think on the North-South point, I mean, I think it's very important that helping Africa is not just for altruistic reasons. There'll be an unstable world if Africans are feeling aggrieved and unfairly treated, as they are being at the moment. It's a festering inequality, just as the huge inequalities within countries like the US and Britain are. And so I think we ought to do something about it in order to ensure a stable and ethical world. Going back to the most recent question, I think I'm thinking about catastrophic rather than maybe existential risk, but what worries me most is the disruptive effects on society from bio-error and bioterror, because as was said, it's fairly small scale technology in dual use equipment. So I worry about that, and also cyber attacks, which are getting more serious as the cyber attackers and the defenders are both empowered by AI. So I think we are going to worry about that, and I'm really scared that that's going to lead to endemic suboptimality, because things are going wrong all the time due to effects like this. But worst of all, I think, is probably bio-error and bioterror. And here we need some sort of surveillance, and is going to sharpen up the tension between three things we want to preserve. One is security, the other's liberty, and the other's privacy. And I think we're going to have to balance those three. I think in China, they'll give up on the privacy and be more secure. It's not clear what they'll do in Western Europe and the US, but I think if we don't have surveillance, then we're going to have these bad actors who can cause global disruption. And that's indeed what I worry most about for the next 20 years.
It's also worth noticing that surveillance quite often get people into this binary mode. Oh, it's about liberty versus security. And of course, people who understand the surveillance issue realize actually it's more complicated than that.
Yes.
The good news is there are ways of structuring transparency and opacity to help privacy or security. We could imagine putting, for example, bomb dogs everywhere to sniff out bombs. That wouldn't be much of an invasion of privacy, because although the dogs presumably learn a lot about us by sniffing at us, they're only going to start barking about bombs. And given that we all understand roughly how dogs work, we would probably be pretty fine with this solution, because generally we would not like to have bombs around. We can imagine technologies like, and here we get to an interesting issue of both technology and kind of social design that would demonstrate themselves in a credible way that this actually improves our safety, but doesn't infringe on our privacy. This is again a fascinating area, because this is where creative thinking can actually solve problems that quite often policymakers think are absolutely impossible to solve. And this is a room for a lot of good thinking.
Very, very interesting. We will now transition to the question and answer section of this discussion. And we've gotten two questions that I'll ask in unison. The first question, I know Toby devotes a lot of his energies in the book to, which is about what general strategies one can take at reducing many kinds of existential risks. And before you sort of chip in there to operationalize it, I will also ask the second question, which is how responsive are governments, in your experience, to advice on existential risks? Because one sort of practically follows from the other. So Toby, please, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so I don't think governments are very responsive to this. My experience with this in the UK setting is that it's generally felt to be above the pay grade of anyone who you pose this this problem to. So this is something where, and I can see why they think that. It just seems so big. You know, even the biggest issues for the UK seem too big, but this is an issue for the whole of humanity, of which the UK only is 1% of the people. And the UK, maybe during the time of the British Empire, they would have thought, yeah, this is our problem, we should deal with this. And the US feels a bit like that now. But ultimately, the UK is not doing this. And they also haven't kind of given that responsibility up a level. You know, there's no one whose pay grade it is. They're not saying that this is the UN's responsibility, and here's the relevant body within the UN who is taking responsibility. Instead, it's just no one has the responsibility. The US has shown some leadership on asteroids, so that is some area where they are kind of stepping up a bit. But generally, people don't see this as their responsibility. And then as to what we can do to deal with a lot of existential risks at the same time, one idea that I put forward in the precipice is the idea of existential risk factors. These are things that are not themselves risks, but which would increase or decrease the total amount of existential risk in the world. So for example, on top of its role as a risk, climate change is a stressor on the global situation, as is, as Martin has said, global inequality between the North and the South. These are things that make it much harder to kind of find the win-wins and to be coordinated at the global level. Another example would be great power war, whether nuclear or otherwise. If we imagine a century in which there's no great power war, or a century in which there is, the amount of existential risk in those two different scenarios will be different by, you know, a percentage point or more. So doing things that work on these risk factors is a way sometimes of dealing with multiple risks at the same time. But at the moment, I think the best thing we can do that deals with many of them at the same time is actually starting these conversations and spreading this idea and refining and improving these ideas around existential risk. if we get to a point where it's considered to be, you know, a major moral issue of our time, that the fact that we're threatening the entire continued thread of human civilization and human existence itself, then that, you know, then there'll be room for action. At the moment, governments don't think that there's a voting kind of bloc, or, you know, anyone who would actually support such policies. In fact, the UK just recently increased its amount of nuclear weapons that it's planning to have, the cap on the Trident nuclear weapons, which I think is insane. But they're not aware that there are people who care deeply about these issues, or that they think there's not very many. So I think that is another kind of thing we can do. And then on top of that, I would say building international institutions. I don't know what the right forms are, perhaps something within the UN framework, to try to take ownership for these risks, or at least to be a centralized body that feels it has some responsibility over this, and where, you know, the consensus position on, you know, on these things can be developed.
Martin, I don't know how public this knowledge is, but my understanding is that you are either commissioning or partaking in an inquiry in the House of Lords on catastrophic risks. A, is that correct? And B, you can perhaps use that to answer both of those questions. Go ahead.
Well, let me just say it's a one-year select committee, and it's entirely public, and its proceedings are public, and many people like Toby have given evidence to it already, and we've had written evidence. It's entirely open. It'll produce a report in November, and the government has to respond to the report, and there'll be a debate in Parliament, etc. And it is addressing these extreme threats. And I'd like to make 2 points. I mean, it's addressing obviously what we can do as a nation, but it's mindful of the fact that many of these threats have to be handled on an international basis. So it's going to make some recommendations, I'm sure, with international. But going back to the question, I think it's clear that these extreme threats have to be handled in a global way, climate, pandemics, etc. But to be honest, this goes back to definitions. I don't think there's anything that we would do for an existential risk that we wouldn't do for catastrophic risk. So I think to introduce the term existential in a narrow sense in which Toby's using it is confusing, because the catastrophic risk is bad enough for most people, and they don't read 𝗘𝘅𝗶𝗂𝗏, they don't care about the extra factor you get there. So I think it's catastrophic risks which we are concerned about, and they are mainly global, and we need to concern about that.
Joan, I want you to come in on that question before Toby sort of bounces back on Martin. And then Anders, there's 7 questions for you, all about the same thing, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes.
Wow.
Joan, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with really everything that I heard Toby say and Martin say as well. And I would just add that I think the innovation is going to need to come from the outside. And to credit the effective altruism community with really making a difference in this space. What I see is growing momentum, a growing awareness, a huge amount of energy kind of pushing into this space and developing ideas which can create the space for change that we need. I totally agree. There is no one in government who believes, who really thinks in this frame yet, but we can change that. We can change that. So let's keep working on it.
Go ahead, Toby.
Yeah, I agree with some of the spirit of what Martin's getting at, the question of, do we need to distinguish, and is it the case that, I agree that if all policy options that treated one treated the other to kind of equal degrees, then the distinction might be important in terms of understanding what are actually the central issues of humanity at the time now, but would be of less importance as a kind of wider policy issue. But I do think that keeping our eye on the prize is particularly important. I've found that when, for example, people talk about North Korea, back during the time when Trump was in a kind of threatening contest, there was a lot of feeling and just equation of North Korea launching a nuclear attack on America as if that was nuclear Armageddon and the type of thing we were talking about in the Cold War. It would instead be a destruction of a city, which would be terrible, but would be, in the scheme of things, smaller than, say, COVID. And smaller than the World War II, whereas the other thing is way bigger than World War II. And, you know, clearly, like, you know, the existential risk or the global nuclear war would be at least 100 times worse, much more than that probably. But so you do get this conflation and this feeling that some of these issues are equivalent. And so one example of this would be the relative question in nuclear disarmament between dealing with the arsenals of the US and Russia, which I think are the only ones that pose an existential risk, although there is some question about whether India and Pakistan do, but versus the question of proliferation. And there has been a lot of focus on proliferation over the years to avoid other countries getting some weapons. But the arsenals that the other countries have built up have not been to this level that they pose this particular kind of threat. They certainly pose a threat that we could call a catastrophe, and perhaps even a global catastrophe, but not an existential risk. And so I do think that, as an example, you know, pushing on deterrence and suggesting that the US, if it knew that it was going to lose New York, Washington, LA, Chicago, if it went to war against Russia, it would have no interest in such a war. And similarly in the other direction. And that could be provided just by submarine-based nuclear weapons. And then you could get rid of all of the ICBMs. And then the threat of nuclear winter would not be there, or at least not a civilization-ending nuclear winter. So that's an example of something that would be extremely important for the nuclear existential risk. And so I think the relative strength of these things do change. But I also think the other thing's important too. And I certainly am not interested in having a competition about it with people who find other causes to be worthy as well. But I do think that it could change these relative strengths. And it's also another kind of style of argument. There can be people who are additionally receptive to it, who are less receptive to the other questions as well.
And this is another example, obviously, of the importance of internal discussions within these both well-intentioned communities. Anders, before you weigh in on both questions, we've gotten several questions directed towards you specifically, although I will posit that the FHI generally, the CSER generally, the NTI generally does this sort of work on how we exactly calculate the probabilities that different risks pose. And it's one of those questions that's very intuitive to some people, obviously, how don't you know? And just completely unintuitive to others. So I take this question with extreme gravity. How exactly do we go about calculating these things? How do we know?
Yeah. So there are some risks that are very nice, like asteroids, because they're well behaved and they're kind of independent of human action. So there you can count the asteroids, you can look at impact craters, and you can find that, oh, there is a power law distribution of asteroid sizes. So you can just extrapolate from data. This is lovely. And this works in some other domains too, where we have this independent data. Sometimes you need to take weird observer selection effects into account. If supervolcanic winters would have wiped us out, we wouldn't be around observing them. So there might be an observer selection effect, but it's a relatively minor one. So for many natural risks, we have enough samples that we can actually do fairly ordinary science about. Things get more iffy when you have a non-stationary system, like pandemics. Certainly there have been outbreaks of disease and pandemics before, but the world has also been changing. The 1918 flu could not have spread globally before that time, presumably, although there had been things like the Black Death. Modern communications, modern warfare enabled that to become a global pandemic, which means that past data now becomes much more hazardous to base your predictions on. The real problem is, of course, things that has never happened before. So I've been tooling around a little bit with the risk of nuclear war. And you can make a Bayesian argument. Oh, there is some constant risk per year. Imagine flipping a coin, and then we do an update. We have observed this many years without nuclear war, and you will get a nice beta distribution. Of course, everybody who understands the situation kind of mildly shake their head. This is a kind of stupid way of using Bayesian probability. But it's a first approach. You can, of course, also go in and look at the international crisis and their structure and try to make something more sophisticated. But at this point, the numbers start to disappear from your papers. You start to realize this is qualitative understanding about how big the risk is. Actually trying to put numbers on them although you might still want to do that to be intellectually coherent, you become much more interested in understanding causal chains, understanding the forms of uncertainty existing. I think Toby has done a marvelous job in his book and dealing with it up to so much that one can deal with. But in the end, you don't necessarily want those numbers to be actuarial good numbers that an insurance company could put a price on. You want to understand, is the risk of accidental nuclear war acceptably low? If it's not, then one could probably get a lot of policymakers to say, oh, we need to actually change things. And I think one can actually demonstrate fairly well, as F. Baum and others at the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute have done, that this looks like it's way higher than it should. If one claims that actually things are way safer, as certain people with insight in the situation have claimed, that actually implies a lot of things about the nuclear system which are very non-trivial. One gets into a useful conversation. But of course, coming from the natural sciences, being very fond of numbers and maths and probability distribution, I'm very happy to build my models. But in the end, all models are wrong, but the useful ones are the ones that guide us towards making better policy. And they're going to be uncertain, but we can also understand some of the uncertainty going into them. Sorry, I don't want to take all the time because I can, of course, obviously go on for hours on this.
No, you're quite right. Baum and Hando's work on planetary boundaries as a way to look at existential risk is extremely instructive. And I do want to tease out where this 1 in 6 thing comes from in Toby's book. But before we do that, Joan, like Anders makes a very interesting point about how numbers obviously have subjective meanings. And we have this thing called the atomic clock by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And it keeps going into smaller and smaller divisions. Eventually, it'll go into nanoseconds, then perhaps picoseconds, to relate greater and greater levels of urgency. And I don't mean to be glib here, but how do you instill urgency in people when you're that close to midnight? Do these probabilities and do numerical frameworks have meaning in terms of pushing the Overton window in that sense?
Well, I think they do have meaning in terms of creating the political space that we need for change. We've not done a good job of communicating the precariousness of the threat. And it's a challenge because in some cases we found, through research on public opinion that this issue is so hard for people to think about that they shut down, right? Nobody wants to think about mass catastrophe and extinction events. So how do we make these issues relevant for people and connect them to their daily lives? And I think you're onto something when you're talking about these are issues that are issues about justice and human rights and morality, that this is one of the biggest moral issues of our time. And I think we need to work on doing a better job of creating narratives that reach people in a way that's relevant. That having been said, I do want to say just a word about, I was a little bit surprised to hear, Toby, you sounded almost sanguine about how we might be able to, you didn't say this exactly, and you quite rightly point out that we ought to focus on risk reduction and do things like take forces off of hair trigger alert, and particularly get rid of the land-based leg, the ICBM. I agree with that. And that having been said, I think even when we do that, we will still be a long way away from out of the woods from an existential or catastrophic standpoint. I will remind people that a single submarine, that is US submarine, can carry, if fully loaded, up to 192 nuclear weapons. And the nuclear weapons aboard a single vessel, modern nuclear weapon, these are on the order of 10 to 20 times greater in their destructive power than the weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just to give people a feel for that. And even the small nuclear weapon states all have, I agree, US and Russia are the, with 91% of the world's arsenals, we ought to focus on them first. But even in exchange, as you know, there's been some good work done, not conclusive, but very good work done on the impact on climate and nuclear winter of an exchange between India and Pakistan could bring about a nuclear autumn or a nuclear winter. And same would be true of any other configuration of two, where we're talking about several hundred weapons on each side. So I'm not nearly as sanguine about the triggers and the tipping points, and I'm really quite taken by what we don't know. And even the good work that's been done to better understand atmospheric effects, nuclear winter in particular, we have a very long way to go to understand some of the social effects of nuclear use. That's a whole research area that's pretty much unexplored, and where we may be able to discern some empirical, do some empirical research from data from volcanic events. I recognize there are challenges in its applicability in today's world, but we don't understand the implications for infrastructure, for trade, for human health, for economies, for civil unrest and governance systems. We would be well advised to do some more research on that to help decision makers understand the implications of this Rube Goldberg contraption that we've built called the nuclear weapons system. It's an absolutely insane system. We would never invent it if we were starting from scratch today and trying to manage the nuclear threat.
Toby, perhaps you could come back on that in brief and perhaps also talk about this 1 in 6 thing. And before you do that, I will set you up in opposition to Martin, which seems to be a consistent theme of this panel, saying that Martin has also posited some probabilities for this century, which are somewhat different. But before we get into that, Toby, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, apologies if I did come across as sanguine about it. I was trying to create a contrast. I do think that some of these things have more effect than others on the existential risk, but exactly where the boundary is, I'm not sure. And we certainly need more work on this. Generally, there's been mainly one team of researchers on nuclear winter, over the last 20 years. Yeah, something like that. And then a few people kind of critiquing them from the sidelines without putting forward anything really that much of their own. And that's not a very healthy research community. We need to get much more research on this really important issue. Regarding the probabilities, I would have, so here are 3 comments. One is, Anders suggested that the asteroids are kind of easy. Some aspect is kind of easy about the asteroids. The chance of getting hit by a 1 kilometer asteroid is the easy bit, but we still have very little idea about whether we'd survive that. And at that point, in this chain of probabilities that get multiplied together, of these conditional probabilities, the conditional probability of human survival, given we get hit by an asteroid of X kilometers, is quite an uncertain function. And guesswork kind of comes right back in again, unfortunately, even there. One area where things are, I think, actually a little bit better is regarding the fossil record. And that's relevant to natural risks because even though the natural risks may not have been constant over time, they've generally been decreasing, if anything, because we've become spread over more continents and adapt to more kind of different ways of life. And so then you can bound the risk if you just assume it's been non-increasing on average over that time period, that we got through 2,000 centuries. So you could treat this as 2,000 different trials, and then you can develop either p-values or Bayes factors on that. And I've got a paper on that topic. So that's a little bit of good news, and it suggests the natural risks are really quite low. When it comes to nuclear, we've had less than 1 century. And so that's compatible with the risk being anywhere from, say, 0% to 90%. Is very, entirely plausible. It could be anything like that. The data just doesn't really constrain it at all. And your prior, or your kind of like, your understanding of the particular issues is what's doing most of the work on your probability, not the fact that we've survived 75 years. But I think that probabilities are very important for decision making and also for just advancing the conversation. So being able to actually express what we actually mean. The IPCC and others sometimes recommend using qualitative language, such as a very low probability. And from memory, they suggest that I would say that there's a very low probability of, that a nuclear war would lead to human extinction. I really don't know how likely that is. I suggest in the precipice that there's something like a 1 in 1,000 chance that humanity's entire story is ended this century due to a nuclear event. I think that's a really high probability. but it's 1 in 1,000. And whether that's high or low depends upon what the stakes are. It's a stakes dependent word. And so it actually doesn't work to try to use strange qualitative terms to refer to these numerical probabilities. I think it's a real mistake when people try to suggest that. If you do that, then you lose about a factor of 10 in your nuance just right off the bat. Like as soon as I write something on a page and you read it, you'll think I'm talking about a number quite different to the number I actually was thinking about. So I try to give numerical probabilities. The downside of that is that people often assume that you can only use numbers if you've got a kind of solid model or something where the number comes from. I just disagree with that. And I have a couple of pages explaining this in the book. I decided adding 10 more pages explaining it would be too many, so I limited myself. But what I try to do is to actually tell the reader what I think are the relative scales of probabilities of these risks. I think there's a number of useful aspects of that. One is to really get across how some of them could be really very much larger than others. In some cases, we're actually fairly confident of that. And then also to give an idea about the general scale I'm talking about. For example, to suggest that I'm not saying it's more likely than not that we'll go extinct this century. At the end of the century, if people come back and say, Toby was wrong, we survived, that actually I would be right. I'm saying there's a 5 in 6 chance that we survive, but I'm saying that the chance that we fail is just too high. And then, so I think I thought it would be a real disservice to the reader for them to get to the end of the book and never find out what I actually think about this, given that I've spent so many years working on it. But I also try to suggest that it's not the case that I think that the arguments I give in the book would compel one to a number like 1 in 6, or that you're an idiot if you don't come up with this number given the details. Whereas maybe in the case of asteroid chance that it hits the Earth, actually the data does compel one to a fairly narrow range of probabilities. I don't think it really does here. But I do think that it helps to advance the conversation by letting people know what we actually think.
Martin, before you chip in there, just a question about what your intuition about these probabilities is. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of press about how Lord Martin Rees thinks there's a 50-50 chance that humanity will extinguish itself in the 21st century. And this isn't an attempt to foster an academic disagreement. It's to say that words have meanings, as Toby said. A 50-50 chance has very different intuitions for people in terms of how they think about this risk than, let's just say, a 1 in 6 chance does. So with that framing in mind, why don't you go ahead?
I mean, let me say, I don't think these numbers can be made very seriously. I said in a book 17 years ago, 50-50 chance of a serious setback to civilization. I incidentally think complete human extinction is very hard to understand. It wouldn't happen in any of the scenarios that Toby's talked about, the pandemic or nuclear winter or something like that. Some people would survive, but again, I don't think these numbers can be seriously advanced at all. And we have to bear in mind that there's a big difference between the ones Anders was talking about, where I agree completely. We can have a long time base and we understand the physics, etc. But we've no idea how things will change in the next 50 years. The command and control system of nuclear weapons is much more vulnerable, for instance. That's a big change. So we don't really know what the risk is going to be. And in terms of pandemics, we can probably estimate that natural pandemics will get more common. Vaccines may get better, I don't know, but engineered pandemics are an entirely new threat, which may completely dominate 10 years and more from now. So I just don't think we can place confident numbers at all, except we have to realize, and Anders made this point, that the human-induced ones are probably increasing in probability decade by decade. And that means that we can't be complacent even if they're low now. They could get very strong. And just to make one other remark, a footnote about the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists clock. Again, that's been traditional, but they changed their policy a few years ago to include not just nuclear issues, but they tried to put in the same parameter the threat from climate change, etc. And it's different, of course, because that's a gradual rather than sudden one. And I think it might be a mistake to try and combine them all. But I think that's the reason why it is closer to midnight than ever before, because they have now realized that we do have these growing threats to the environment and to the climate of reaching tipping points, etc.
Thank you, Martin. And I think this states perhaps the largest category of questions we got, which was centered around probability. The second largest theme of questions we've got, and these seem to be fans of the philosopher David Benatar, the famous anti-natalist. These people ask us, why is life worth living? Namely, if we expect the future to be worse, then why are we trying to preserve the future? This seems to be a philosophical discussion amongst some, but considering that this is a question that several people have asked, I would love for all of you to chip in there. Toby, why don't we start with you and then perhaps Martin?
Sure. I mean, if you expected the future would be worse than the present, and you thought the present was a veil of tears and was like a misery that was worse than nothing, then I guess I wouldn't be all that excited about preserving the future. That said, there's still an argument for it, which is that you could find out if the future is indeed as bad as all that. And then if it's not, then you could save it at the later point. So I actually think that there would still be an argument for saving it. But I just very strongly disagree that either that life at the moment is of some like below zero level, or that things are getting worse overall. If you think about all of the things that you hate about the world, and then you go back a couple of hundred years, then I would think that other than environmental things, most of those things are even worse back then. If you hate inequality and injustice towards women and other groups, go back in time. I mean, it was not that long ago that they didn't have the vote and that they were just hopelessly abused and subjugated. So I think that ultimately, while we've got a long way to go in terms of creating a truly just world, I think that things by and large on a century to century timescale have fairly robustly been getting better over the last 1,000 years or more. And so I would think that, I would kind of dispute the premise. I would say that things have been getting better, and also that that things, while certainly have a lot of existing problems, are indeed better than nothing. That there's a lot to value in each of our lives.
Thank you. Martin, please.
Well, I mean, I agree with what Toby said about lives getting better and better, but I'd like to add that if we go back to medieval times, as I did in my introductory thing, lives were miserable, but there wasn't much they could do about it. Now lives are much better than they were in medieval times, but the gap between the way things are and the way they could be is far wider, because it would be possible to give everyone a really decent life. And the indictment of the world now is that the money which the 1,000 richest people in the world have could double the income of the bottom billion in the world. And that's not happening. And when things like that are happening, we can't say that there's ethical progress on the global scale. So things are better, but ethically, we are not improving. The improvements are due to science and technology. So that's a point I want to make. On the thing about whether it would be better if we weren't born and all that, I think there's it seems to me, from what Parfit says, there's a conflation between two levels. One is when you're on the whole happy rather than unhappy. And the other is the much lower threshold where you think it's worth going on being alive. Lots of people would say they're unhappy rather than happy, but they still want to go on being alive. And I don't think that utilitarians properly take account for these big psychological differences. I think that's one problem. And I have many other criticisms of utilitarian arguments as used by effective altruism supporters. But I think we've got to bear in mind that we do have to make sure that people don't despair. And we are in a world where many people may despair. And of course, the threats we're talking about now are new. And although the figures for life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, etc., are getting better, we've got these new things which we are starting to worry about, and they're getting more serious year by year.
Anders, I want you to chip in here as well. But before that, I'm actually interested to hear what Joan thinks. I know this strays outside of your expertise, but as someone who's just trivially devoted her entire life towards protecting the future, in a very personal sense, outside the realm of academic argument about antinatalism versus a so-called net positive experience. Just as a person who heard this question, what do you think about this?
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, you're right. I've devoted my life to trying to overcome these kinds of challenges, and I would never have survived in this field for 35 years if I didn't have a pretty large dose of optimism about the future and why it's worth preserving. So I think it is, I dare say, both a pessimistic question and a quite academic question. And I cannot improve on the answers that Toby and Martin have offered. I did want to just digress for 10 seconds and back on the question of probability, point out that in the absence of our ability to be able to quantitatively reach a persuasive number, we have to ask ourselves, this is a question that Martin Hellman explored in an article just recently published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and I think his question is a good one. With respect to nuclear, can we responsibly bet humanity's future on a strategy for which the risk of failure is totally unknown? And the answer is, of course, no, right? And we've got our work cut out for us. We know what we need to do to back away from that precipice, and that's what we should be working on, more so than philosophizing about whether life is worth living or not. Let's keep making it worth living.
That is very fair. Anders, please go on.
Yeah, so it's quite easy to joke, of course, that for any position there is always a philosopher holding that. And Benatar and people like him, they have cropped up throughout the history of philosophy, but it's never been a particularly popular position. Indeed, they spend quite some time arguing why everybody else is wrong and mistaken about it. However, there is a related position that actually has some traction and might matter, and that is an ecocentric position. The view that actually humans might not matter, but the biosphere matters. Species might have intrinsic value, or even ecosystems. And of course, if you take this to an extreme, you might end up saying that maybe humans don't matter at all. We should be kind of getting rid of the humans for the sake of the biosphere. Quite a lot of environmental ethicists are way more sensible than that, of course, and say that humans have value, but so does the biosphere. But one of the interesting things I'm exploring, a paper I'm working on right now, is of course the point that if humanity disappears, the biosphere is still going to go extinct in about 1 billion years, give or take a few 100 million years, because of the sun becoming more luminous, and that is going to bring the geochemical cycles out back. We could probably, if we stayed around, or whether we put robots on the task, actually add billions of years to the lifespan of the biosphere. And if you take an ecocentric perspective, that's a tremendous amount of value. Even if you don't care the least about humans, instrumentally, this sounds like a very strong reason to have humans around. And I think there are quite a lot of different value theories, ranging from the really weird and exotic ones to fairly everyday ones, that give a lot of very different reasons why we ought to stay around and not irreversibly disappear from the scene. Yeah, we need to shape up morally against each other and to the biosphere, but there is a good reason to be optimistic about the future. What I like actually about the existential risk community, and a journalist was complaining about to me when he was at one of the get-togethers at Cambridge, was everybody's so cheerful. The journalists had hopes for black-clad people mourning the imminent demise of humanity, and instead found us cheerfully sipping our tea and talking about probabilities of horrible events. And I told him, look, you need to be an optimist to be here. You need to both think that there is something positive about the future. The future could become better. It's worth fighting for. And you also need to think we can do something about it, even if it's really, really tiny. And that's actually why I find the global catastrophic risk and existential risk community to be very cheerful and very enjoyable to be around, because maybe we're overly optimistic. So what? We're still trying to help the world.
That's very interesting. And the way I at least think about antinatalism is that perhaps we should give that opportunity to people in the future as well to perhaps decide for themselves as to whether the future is worth living or not. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So the last bucket of questions we got, I would be very grateful that you could frame around concluding remarks as well. And this general bucket of questions is about what global governance of existential risk looks like. There's sort of two case studies given here. So the first is a more League of Nations style, a renewed birth, rising from the ashes, new organizations being set up for existential risk. And then the second is a bit more incrementalist, working in the confines of the UN, the WTO, the WHO. Namely, do you see a radical reformism at play in terms of X-risk mitigation structurally, or do you see that the current institutions that exist can be reformed to the extent that we can mitigate X-risk sufficiently? And please also interplay that with your concluding remarks. Why don't we start with Martin? Please, go ahead.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think we need global level regulation for each of these separately. We need a stronger WHO to deal with pandemics. We need some body to monitor compliance with pledges to cut CO2 emissions and to monitor global energy. And we certainly need to have some international body to monitor the internet and cyber, because no national body can compete even with these big conglomerates, the commercial conglomerates in the United States in particular. So all those require international bodies of various kinds. I think beyond that, we do need to have agreements on what is feasible and what isn't, and also on how far ahead we can really plan. And to go back to my biggest worry, which is bio and cyber, what my worry is that it's going to be possible to engineer viruses and things like that, and there'll be regulations, inter-academy meetings of all kinds that are going to regulate those, but enforcing those regulations globally is, in my view, going to be as hopeless as enforcing the drug laws globally or the tax laws globally. And so my worry is that whatever can be done will be done somewhere by someone. And that's where catastrophe will start. So that's why I mentioned the concern about surveillance as being essential. So that's my pessimism, but we do need to have global bodies for these different kinds of threats. And also for the environment, because I like Anders's point that there is value in the world apart from human beings, and we have an obligation to cherish that.
Thank you very much, Martin. Joan, please.
So I think it's important that we work to stretch our imaginations and not be bound by what we know about how the world operates today. And in that sense, I would tend to believe that it's going to be new structures and new organizations, and not just an incremental adjustment or increase in authorities of existing institutions. I don't think we yet understand, because we haven't done the hard work to envision and imagine what these new structures need to do, and therefore what they need to look like. But this is an area that's ripe for research. I think I would posit the idea that there will be some commonalities across these different threat areas in terms of the types of structures. I mean, the institutions may not be exactly the same, because what you need for climate is going to be different for nuclear, is going to be different for bio, but some aspects of new structures that we create may have some characteristics in common in terms of them not being populated only by sovereign states or representatives from sovereign states, but some kind of private sector, civil society representation as well. I think we really, again, need to explore and think about new ways to come back together to build the structures that are fit for purpose for today's world. And I would just conclude by saying, I think we are, to use Toby's word, at the precipice, not only in terms of the dangers we face, but of the opportunity for transformation in terms of how we rebuild the world that we need. And that's an incredibly exciting point in history to be alive and to have the opportunity to participate in this transformation. And I hope all of the people listening to this seminar will think about how they can become activated and get engaged in this, really important work. Be a part of the solution, help be part of the moonshot. This is a really exciting endeavor.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Joan. Anders, please.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's very important to think about new forms of innovative institutions. I think Martin is right that we're stuck with a lot of institutions. And if we look back historically, we find that much of how our societies work grows out organically. A lot of the map of Europe is because of who married whom in various medieval courts. There are a lot of random reasons why certain institutions exist, and they're very hard to change. But it's also possible to add new institutions. And there are probably much more bizarre and interesting possibilities than most people think about. I vividly remember seeing a diplomat, his face when he suddenly understood what those blockchain people were talking about, when he realized, oh, contracts that are not enforced by state power. Maybe it's a bad idea, but he realized that's something utterly alien. In his world, that wouldn't exist. And suddenly he realized, oh, they do exist somewhere in the cloud. And I think in the same way, there are plenty of other things that might actually make many people's eyes light up, because we are finding interesting solutions. I'm in contact with some people who work on eliciting people's preferences using artificial intelligence systems, trying to actually aggregate preferences on a massive scale using AI, not so much for alignment purposes of AI, but for alignment purposes of the economy. Whether this is doable or even a good idea, we don't know yet. It's early days. It's worth recognizing that the information technology society has, in some sense, puts a limit on what political systems and institutions it can have. You can't run a parliamentary democracy without a printing press and literacy. But even after the printing press showed up, it took about 300 years to try out all sorts of ways of organizing a parliamentary democracy and coming up with various functions and structures that work and figure out which ones are devastatingly bad. Now we have done the same thing with the internet and AI and other forms of software. And well, maybe it's going to take 300 years to figure that one out. We might not have 300 years, but I think there's plenty of time and opportunity here over the next few decades to actually innovate new forms of institutions, which might indeed make the people at the United Nations go, what? Is that even possible? Wow.
Thank you very much, Anders. And then finally, Toby, please.
Yes, I think we need to do a lot of both of these things. I think that over the longer time periods, we're going to need to have new innovative institutions to deal with these problems. The previous ones weren't designed for these types of problems. They were designed for a very narrow situation where if you think about the Security Council, which has a lot of the power in the UN, for the situation of sharing power between victors in a world war, and also trying to govern the issue about these victors then getting into a Cold War. But this is a very different kind of situation to what we're going to be facing. I think we're going to need substantial creativity. I really like that idea from Joan, that we need people to think big and ambitiously, and also optimistically and creatively about what can be done over longer timeframes. But in that case, I'm thinking decades or something like that. I'm not sure that there's going to be some large rival to the UN, created as an international structure within a shorter period than that. But I think in a shorter time period, we need to be working on making the most of the systems that we do have. So, for example, the Bioweapons Convention, which is like the main group or main treaty that's dealing with preventing bioweapons. It has extremely little funding or staffing. It has less funding than a typical McDonald's. It's another example of our priorities being significantly out of whack on this. And we need to be able to increase that and actually also give it some teeth in terms of inspecting ability. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing, both aimed at shorter term goals and shorter term victories for the community to help push us on, but then also keeping an eye on the longer term. And I also want to stress that that while this international frame is an important one, there are probably many organizations and institutions and communities which are going to be central to this, which are not operating at that level. So, for example, there are the scientific communities around some of the scientific areas that could lead to some of these risks. So, for example, biotechnology or around artificial intelligence, and getting those communities to care about these issues and such that they want to succeed in them and they want to produce a safe world, and that they're really taking these things seriously is a really key aspect compared to trying to get some other group of people to enforce the people who don't really want to care about the thing. That's not a real solution. So we want to try to actually motivate them and teach them these things. And then there's also various other parts of civil society that are also going to be very involved in this. As there had been in the case of nuclear over the last 75 years. So I see room for all of these things, and I think we need to push on all of them, and people need to play to their strengths regarding kind of which part of this puzzle that they want to be.
Toby, Joan, Martin, Anders, thank you very much for attending this panel. For the thousands of students across the world who were subscribed to this summit, I hope that the merit of the ideas presented, the moral immensity of them, in any case, convince you that what they see as the fight for our lives is the fight of our lives. On that note, this panel is coming at its conclusion. I will point out that in 30 minutes, we have a keynote from an altogether different sort of speaker who isn't necessarily an academic, but more an activist. We have Daniel Ellsberg, who is of prominence of leaking the Pentagon Papers, and since then his anti-war activism, giving the speech which provides the culmination for the summit. Thank you everyone for attending this panel, and we will see you in half an hour's time.